Okay, so welcome to today's presentation from the Fayetteville Public Library called Behind the Scenes of Video Game Design. My name is Dave Frederick, and I am a professor of classics, which means Greek and Latin and ancient history at the University of Arkansas. But that's like kind of my day job. I spend at least half of my time also running the Tesseract Center for Immersive Environments and Game Design at the University of Arkansas. And that's really what we're going to talk about today. Not much about classics, a lot more about video games. That's a little bit about me, and I'll talk a little bit more about Tesseract at the end of my part of this presentation. And it's going to come in two parts. The first part of this presentation is going to be about video games more generally, like why they're important, their global impact. And then we're going to segue over to Shartan and Greg from Causeway Studios, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves, and they'll present sort of the second half of this presentation, which will be about their experience as video game designers now in a game startup in Northwest Arkansas. So do you guys want to say a little bit about yourselves?
Yeah, sure. So my name's Greg. I'm one of the co-founders of Causeway Studios, and we are making an indie game that we'll talk about a bit later, and we'll get a bit more into kind of my backstory and some more into who we are in our section of the talk. But I'm Greg, and it's nice to meet all of you.
And I'll say the same thing. I'm Shartan, again, co-founder with Greg of Causeway Studios, but we'll get into the details a bit later.
No, that sounds good. And I'm super excited to hear the presentation from Greg and Shartan. They are both alumni of the Tesseract Center. And while there and after leaving Tesseract, they're doing great things. So I'm super proud of them and also super curious about what they're making at Causeway. So this will be very much fun for me as well. So you might, let me get over here and try that. Okay, so one could immediately ask, especially in the context of a public library with interest obviously in books, like why video games? What makes them significant to talk about? What makes them culturally significant? And I've chosen this image from PUBG, PlayerUnknown Battlegrounds, because it represents a pretty common stereotype about games and their content. That they're masculine focused, they're super violent. Not a lot of girls or women are playing games, that they're not concerned with people of color or LGBTQ identities. And unfortunately, some of the stereotype is true. And so it's easy to see why people might be skeptical about video games and their larger cultural value. But one of the things we have to acknowledge about video games and why they're significant is really economic. And that is the video game market itself is global and very, very large. And you can get some figures from this. You can see that probably North America is still the largest market for video games at $39.6 billion and rising. You can see the rate of increase there if you can read the slide like at 11.7%. Asia Pacific is 72, that puts together a lot of countries, that's $72 billion. And so if you sort of start thinking in those terms, video games are a very large industry, which doesn't necessarily mean that we should automatically give them like cultural value. Like there's still a lot of issues in video games to be quite concerned about. But there's also a lot behind the scenes in video games and in the smaller markets and smaller games that get made that culturally quite significant. And a lot of the evolution in video games is in fact driven from below by indie games and what they're willing to talk about, the themes they're willing to put forward. And so on the one hand, we might make a very bold statement. Games are arguably the world's most important medium of communication. And the reason we might make a statement like that is because you can see that games now gross in terms of what they make, more than music and film combined. So in terms of gross sales, games are, to that extent, more important. But I think we really, really want to be aware that money does not equal significance all the time. And so thinking in the context of a public library and thinking in the context of the cultural importance of film and music and books, we might want to look sort of below the AAA surface of shooters and games like PUBG at what's happening in terms of how we can make games now, the kinds of indie games we are seeing, the value of those games, the themes that they engage, and the accessibility, the growing accessibility of game making software. So that's where we're going to head here for just a few minutes. And so I've sort of, for this slide, rephrased the sentence from before. Interactive real-time 3D is transforming entertainment and education globally. This one's really hard to refute. Right, so if you look at the top image on the slide, you see that The Guardian, which is a really significant global news outlet, has given a very prominent review to a game called Journey, which is not a shooter by any stretch, which is really stresses cooperative gameplay, is much more both philosophical and meditative. Very different kind of game than the stereotype of games. But the fact that The Guardian put this out front and reviewed it, gave it 5 stars, it's a great, great game. And that points to the emergent recognition of games that aren't shooters, that aren't AAA, that engage things like a friendship with other players, like sympathy and empathy for other human beings, different kinds of lead characters, people of color as leads, LGBTQ lead characters. This is the direction that indie games are going. And by indie games, maybe good to pause just for a second and provide some definition. AAA means the games produced by the largest studios. And some famous shooters, like a one that just came out, Red Dead Redemption 2, is a very, very major AAA studio game. Indie games are much smaller, and they're made by much smaller teams. The upfront financial risk is much less. And so because of that, they can take risks. And those risks are what is pushing the envelope of what gets represented in games. Beyond that, the fact of, and we'll talk a little bit about this in just a second, the fact of game engines, and we'll define that term in a second, that the things, the technology, the software that is used to make real-time video games. And real time means you can jump into that 3D world, make decisions, turn your body around in it, jump and shoot or run and do all these things in that 3D space. That's real time 3D. The power of this for training across all kinds of fields has definitely emerged and is being utilized. And so there's lots of both desktop and VR applications now to train people to do all kinds of things, because you can train and make mistakes in that virtual 3D world, and it looks and feels very much like the real world. And obviously your mistakes don't have permanent real world consequences. And so medical training, surgery training, how to stock shelves, all kinds of things are being taught now, and like diagnosis of what's wrong with a airplane engine. All these things are being taught through virtual means. And those virtual means are assembled or put together using game engine, game building technology. So video games are extremely important as a technology and a form of communication quite outside of games themselves, which means we have to pay attention to how games get made, because not just the technology, but the design approaches, the learning approaches of games are now finding themselves deployed across all of these industries. And that's super exciting and super important. Okay, so we want to advance. Well, so indie video games, because of how they push the envelope of themes and narrative and choices and outcomes in games, have become extremely important, way beyond just their sort of financial, like the money that they earn. So it's very worthwhile to give a more nuanced picture to what games are about and what they do. And some of the indie video games that have become quite well known, I'll just sort of quickly summarize these. Dear Esther will go left and across. So Dear Esther is probably one of the first in this genre, called walking simulators, where you explore an abandoned island off the coast of Scotland. And that exploration of this desolate abandoned island is a way of working through the sense of loss of the main character for his wife, who was killed in an automobile accident. Now, you wouldn't think that'd be a promising sort of premise for a game, but in fact, this game has received all kinds of critical attention. It's super cool and also really moving and very interesting narrative built around sort of this dual sense of exploration and abandonment of the island and trying to come to terms with deep emotional, psychological loss. Gone Home's not so different in terms of theme, that the lead character comes home, finds that her family's all gone from their house, and has to explore a sort of dual narrative of her father's own sexual abuse and the fact that her younger sister has come out as gay, and the impact that had on the family and how she tried to negotiate that. So you kind of excavate this narrative as you explore the house. And again, this is not like, that's way, way far away from a AAA shooter in terms of what's being explored, the themes presented. And Tacoma is a futuristic sort of set in space kind of game, but it explores the nature of AI intelligence and the emotionality that's possible with an AI character, because you explore the space station that has undergone this catastrophe, but in fact, behind the scenes is an AI intelligence that helps guide you through the story. And it turns out may have been given sort of a directorial role in shaping the story, and has exhibited in how the story is told a significant amount of sympathy for the various characters that you encounter. So there's a game that really starts looking at the borderlands between human and artificial intelligence and emotions. And finally, Life is Strange, it tackles what's become a, not super common, but familiar issue in video games. And that's, what if you could rewind time and causality? And you explore the relationship between the two lead female characters and the unique ability of your character to rewind time and take back choices that you've made. Except when you get down to the conclusion of the game, there aren't takebacks. And this is overlapped with a sense of impending ecological doom. And what point do we get to with that before there's no rewinds? Right, so each one of these games has a quite sophisticated narrative, thematic arc. That's what indie video games are about. And these are typically made by, not like it's made by more than 4 people as a rule, these kinds of games, but probably less than 40. And so this means this type of expression is much more approachable by many more smaller teams. And so we're getting an explosion of indie video games, many of which are super interesting from narrative, mechanical standpoints. To go along with that is the emergence of game engines that you can use, or I can use, or Chartan or Greg can use. And a game engine is basically that, it's kind of like video editing software. And that in a game engine, you pull together all the pieces that are going to go into your video game, the code and the sound and the 3D modeled set, the characters, those all come together on what is essentially a stage inside the game engine, where you put together how all those elements of your game are going to interact. It used to be that these kinds of game engines were in cost very unapproachable, in complexity very unapproachable. That has changed rapidly over the last decade, and the 2 main game engines that most smaller game makers use are Unity and Unreal. And both of these engines, they excel at somewhat different things. And so it's like a tool you could use for this kind of game or for that kind of game. And for that reason, it's good to have them both. And people are, in terms of learning how to make a video game, these are sort of your gateway platforms in. And for like hobby people, or people just getting used to making games and getting their feet wet, both of these are free. And so that, and quite fully featured as when they're free. And so it's only as you start to make a product that's commercially viable that you have to start paying. That really changes the runway into making video games. It's a huge transformation. And that's why I've put what used to be, or maybe still is, the mantra of Unity on the top of that slide: democratize 3D. That is to get very, very many more people making video games. Because the more people we have and the more diverse those people are making these video games, that means the genre itself becomes much more diversified. And since it's such a powerful way of telling stories, we have accessibility to that form of communication by many more people globally. And that's a big deal for storytelling, a very big deal. So for us, Greg, Chartan, and myself, everyone at Tesseract, and people making indie video games, this whole trajectory over the last 20 years or so has been super exciting. And along with the sort of horror stories you get about both content and labor practices in AAA gaming. You have, on the other hand, the story of the emergence of indie games, of approachable game engines that makes this form of communication so much more accessible. That's really, really important for education. It's important for scientific research. It's important for industry. It's important for retail because of the ability of games to carry all of those messages. So recognizing that, this is a quick, and we're not going to get into any kind of tutorial about how to use a game engine, but this shows you what's going on. And that at the bottom part of the slide, you have all of your assets that you could put on the stage and start putting together. On the right-hand side, you can select whatever those assets are and change aspects about them. And so essentially, you're bringing these various assets, some of which are 3D and sculpted, some of which are music. Hey, my light just went off, so I'm going to stand up. Okay, so some of which are music, some of which are voice acting, some of which are 3D characters that are animated. All those things are going to go onto that stage that's on the left-hand side where you see the sculpture. And then you can articulate relationships between them so that where the camera moves, right? Is the camera behind the character? Is it identified with the player's own sense of vision? How they move around and look? Is it how the characters are going to jump? How smoothly they animate? All of this, all these forms of expression are being brought together on the stage of that game engine, which is why there's that phrase, a game engine is where all that stuff happens. And there's a lot to learn, obviously, there, but it really is true that the process of learning how to do that, assembly thing and bring all these pieces together and have a team collaborate to make a game has become way more accessible. So it's very exciting news. And this is essentially rephrasing what I just talked about. That is, a game engine is where all these different disciplines that go into making stuff for games, they all get together inside that game engine. And that means making games is generally, with very few exceptions these days, a team activity. And you can see the benefit of that for education because you're bringing together kids that will do maybe the creation of the characters or their animation, students that will take care of the environment and its layout, students that will design the interactivity, students that will write the script. All of those things have to come together to make the game. That means for me and Tesseract, bringing together student teams and leads who frequently, in fact, always to this point, have always been ex-students at the U of A. They've graduated, but now they're leads with the full-time job. They're putting all of this together. It's extremely exciting to have all that creativity together in a room and focus towards that kind of goal. And it's extremely powerful for the student teams because of that drive to collaborate successfully on the project. That's teaching them so-called soft skills that are hard to reproduce in other endeavors. So it gives them a sort of skill set that is exactly what a lot of employers very much want. So it's extremely powerful. All of that being said, if we look at the global distribution, this is not to jump on Unity or anything, but if you look at the global distribution of their offices, you can see a pattern that does not include Africa, the Middle East, the Indian subcontinent. And so for all of its global distribution, making games still remains pretty much a Eurasian and especially a North American and European phenomenon. If we look more closely, we see that outside of Austin, Texas, the Midwest, we probably, at some point they may get a Chicago office, but anyway, Chicago is pretty significant for game making these days, but the Midwest is largely overlooked, as is the South. So that's an opportunity right here in our own state to bring game design, its technical skills, its artistic skills, all that could bring to an industry like retail. To develop that here in Northwest Arkansas is definitely something that excites me a lot, and because I see that its ability to transform education in the state. So this is a map of where game design can go. And the more we bring in the dark areas of this map, the richer, the more diverse game development becomes. That is, in a sense, of the history of narrative, because all those different narrative traditions, right, of Africa, of India, start to impact how games get made and how we think about them. So that's a really powerful look into the future of games, I think. In terms of Arkansas, this is just a picture into the Tesseract Center, where I am right now, unfortunately, all alone because of what we're facing in terms of the pandemic. But this is a place where student teams get together and make games for university classes and university research. We've been in existence as a center for about 6 years now. We have typically 16 to 20 student interns and 4 full-time leads. We're definitely looking to expand. And so if you're at all interested in game design in this university context, I would very much urge you to reach out to Tesseract or to me, and happy to talk about it. So I think that's my part of the presentation. So I am gonna go over here and stop share.
Thanks, Dave.
Sure.
Oh, hi there. As we mentioned earlier, we are the two founders of a Northwest Arkansas-based independent game studio, and we've been lucky enough to be working in the games industry or just adjacent to it for over a decade between the two of us, which is kind of crazy to say.
Yeah, so before we jump into the bulk of it here, I want to take a moment and just kind of stop and acknowledge that we all generally know what video games are, but especially for people who are in the industry, who are around this technology and use it, it's easy for us to forget that it's often rare for people to know exactly how these things get made, even in a very like high level conceptual way. And a great example of that is myself, that whenever I was an undergraduate at the University of Arkansas, and I knew that at that point I was interested in wanting to try to get into game development. Even then, I didn't really understand what all the pieces that go into making it are. Because at the time, I had just picked up a second degree I was working on. It was creative writing. So at the time, I was focused on being a writer. And that's kind of what I was focused on. I liked narrative. There were certain narrative games that had inspired me. And so I've gone to the Game Developers Conference, which happens usually in San Francisco. It's not happening this year, obviously, in 2012, where just everyone comes together in the industry. And I remember walking up to a Sony booth. They're known for their PlayStation system. And I said, I would like to apply for an intern position for writer, please. And they said, we don't hire writers. And I'm like, oh, okay. And I was very shy, and then I walked away. That's not to say that they don't hire writers. It was entry-level intern positions, but that was almost, I was limiting myself too much. And what I didn't realize is what I would actually go on to do was the job of a game designer. But I didn't realize that a game designer was an actual job. Now, there are a lot of things that fit with under a game designer. It could be level designer, a systems designer, a narrative designer, but I didn't really click. It didn't really click with me that, yeah, there are people who come up with the rules of these games, that design the spaces that people play in, that design the narrative experiences. I mean, a great example is other kinds of games, right? Board games, when you have that big sheet of rules that you have to read, and everyone, you know, is talking over you as you're trying to explain the rules of how to play Settlers of Catan or anything like that. Someone actually has to sit down and decide what those rules are. How are they balanced? What makes them fun? What makes it a system of play that's fun to play with? And so I just wanted to start this with acknowledging, hey, we don't always understand how games get made, even if we know what video games are. And so we, Shartan and I, are going to try to dip our toe just a little bit and pull back the curtain just a bit to give you a glimpse into that.
And so we are Causeway Studios, and our goal is to tell stories that are made for games. And in order to do that, we've decided that we're a human-focused game studio, and that's because people matter. As the movement is happening right now, you know, Black Lives Matter, and we're doing that, and we're human-focused in that we're investing in diversity with the team that we're building, with the artists and designers that we're hiring. We are investing in making sure that everybody can collaborate, that this is not some dictatorship with everybody executing on things, but rather everybody's working together and making decisions together. And we're investing in people because we want to build a stable and enduring studio, but also game development community here in Northwest Arkansas. And we're going to use all of this as context to, as Greg said, pull back the curtain on how we're making games.
Yes, so get to go into a little more detail about Causeway Studios specifically, that as our tagline says, we're really focused on making games with a narrative focus because we think that that's our particular strength, but that's also one of the elements, as Dr. Frederick was talking about in his portion of the talk, that indie games really shine at. They can go into types of experiences that these big AAA games don't normally wander into, whether they're too afraid to do that or whether the risk of the large budgets that they have doesn't permit them to take that risk. But specifically when we're looking at games as a canvas for our stories, is that we don't just want to tell stories, right? We have a video game studio, a video game company. We make video games. So the stories that we tell, we want those to take unique advantage of the video game format. Things, the most obvious one being interactivity, right? Goes into that real-time component that Dave was talking about, where you can get into a world, you can get into a story, and you can twist the knobs, you can poke the story can poke you back. Elements like player agency, where players can actually go in and change what happens to the story. They can change how their characters develop, change the directions that the plot goes, or change how they experience things. Or even elements of what I like to call player expression, where think about it as not necessarily what you're doing, but how you're doing it. But even if the story ends up in the same place, giving people the ability to express how they want characters to behave or react to certain instances may not change the overall arc of the plot, but it absolutely changes the experience of the story. And while we always want to make games that are narrative focused, we're also not particularly tied down to a specific genre, because we play all different kinds of games and there is not a narrative genre. Walking Simulator is one of those. It's probably one of the most purely narrative focused ones, but a first-person shooter can have a really strong, deep narrative focus if the correct attention is paid to it. There's always exceptions to the rules, but that's what we're looking to do. Because when it comes down to it, it's always about the experience, right? You're not making story, you're not making mechanics, you are, but it's about what all those things add up to. It's not just the script, it's the experience that players have. And so for our game specifically, we want to tell stories where the players come alongside of us and can co-author their own experiences, which is really something that's only possible in video games. And we're tying all of this together with the idea that we are designing a universe. The phrase that we like to use is we're building worlds across the causeway. Why Causeway? Why did we name our studio Causeway? There's several reasons, but one of the big reasons is, well, what is a causeway? A causeway is a bridge, normally an earthen embankment that's built to ford bodies of water. And so as a metaphor, that's kind of how we see it, is our games are this bridge. They're this causeway that go out into this ocean of possibility. It's this possibility space that has all these different stories that you might have. And so we're building this universe of shared stories. Not really in the same way that the most famous example of a kind of a shared universe is the Marvel Cinematic Universe, right? I'm less interested in doing something that everything builds up to this interconnected thing and everything is within a certain canon. There's nothing wrong with that, but I'm more interested in more of stories that live alongside each other, that are vignettes that wander in and out of one another. That create these strange connections and endless possibilities. And we're doing this because I think it's a way of actually not stifling creativity. That we're doing it as a way of engaging people with these strange worlds that you never know where you might go. And it's a model that allows the creative teams that we're building to not be locked into, oh, we're in this one universe, therefore we must follow the direction of the creative director and that's it. No, it's built as a place where all these voices can come in, and it's a universe that can expand with all different kinds of stories in the same way that Dr. Frederick was talking about the game industry needs to move towards. It's great for our creative teams. It creates a platform for a community of players to come around and discuss and feel like that it's a place that they belong and that they can see themselves in, and they can voice, add their voices to. And it's also a way of hopefully setting ourselves apart as a studio within a crowded indie market that is making a lot of really cool stuff right now. So that's an overview for how we're approaching the types of stories and games that we're making as a company.
And we want to give a concrete example of how we make games so you can go forward and do the same thing. But first, we want to give one last piece of context, which is how we each got here and how we're applying that to what we're doing. And so I personally had this winding path through disciplines where back in high school, I was going to be an environment and character artist. I ended up going to the University of Arkansas here as a music major, eventually switched into computer science, and that's the degree I graduated with. I was at Tesseract for a while as a programmer and designer, and I mean, honestly, everything like everyone is at Tesseract. I went to Amazon as an engineer and switched into user experience design, and then I ended up at Unity, where I've been for the past 2.5 years as a user experience designer. And now I'm at Causeway combining all of that to make games. And the purpose of that whole journey is that I haven't built up some library of technical skills across disciplines, because honestly, I've forgotten most of it. But what it comes back to is that I've learned to collaborate with people in all those disciplines and bring all of that together. And I've seen firsthand that everything great doesn't come from a single discipline or a single person. It comes from a group of people from different backgrounds with different skills, combining and becoming greater than the sum of their parts. And that's, to me, what games exemplify with the sort of graph that Dave showed earlier that had all of these different disciplines that can contribute to games equally.
Yeah, and so I also had a winding path, although my path was more winding within a particular entity, which was the University of Arkansas and Tesseract. So I was first exposed to what would become Tesseract and Dr. Frederick at my freshman year at the University of Arkansas in 2008. And it really started with me taking courses that involved game engines. The first one I took was one that Dave offered. It's called Digital Pompeii. It was reconstructing the ancient Roman city of Pompeii using 3D modeling software and Unity as a real-time engine. And I was just looking for opportunities just to begin, what is something that I can do that can get me game adjacent so I can learn and figure out if it's something that I want to do or that I'm good at. That eventually gave way to, all of a sudden, Dave's putting together a team to build an online video game that's meant to teach Greek and Roman mythology as part of course content. And I was like, yeah, I want to be part of that. And so that kind of sucked me into the beginnings of what would be Tesseract. I started off as a narrative designer and a level designer. I wrote the scripts and I helped put together levels on a game that actually received some international recognition. A couple of the games that Tesseract's made have received awards from the European Conference for Game-Based Learning. And so that was a good confidence booster, let's say, when you're getting in there and you going out from a place like Arkansas, and you realize that you can make things that can be seen as having value. And then I became the design and narrative lead at Tesseract, and that was really a transitioning process of honing my own craft, but also learning how to lead and manage and mentor a team, which it's a whole new discipline than just being able to make games. And then that leads to the last part of my Tesseract journey, which was I became the creative director of the studio. And so that just amplified what I had to directing and mentoring things on a creative scale across the entire studio, which then leads to me starting the studio with Shartan. And throughout this process, I think I've learned the secret to making a successful video game. So I'm going to share that with all of you right now. So what is not the secret to making a successful video game? I think I can definitively say that it's not about any single idea. It's not about a core idea. I have this great idea for a game. It's not about a game mechanic. It's not about some, compelling story or set of characters. It's not about even some revolutionary technology. Oh, if we can just take advantage of VR, it'll be solved. No, it's none of those things. I think the secret of making a successful video game comes down to two things, and that is people and process. Because when you start making a game, you have all these assumptions, you have all these great ideas, you have a story, you have mechanic, you have technology. Everything changes. Nothing stays the same. And that's a good thing. That's a really good thing, because your ideas become better when you can work on them with other people and see how they change to be what they actually need to be in the process. And the people you decide to make your games with, they are the most important part of that experience. So choosing who you make games with, that is the thing that's not going to change. That's the people, that's the crucible that you're going to be in with those people, which then leads to, okay, well then what process enables you to come together as a group of game developers and iterate on that stuff? And that's we're going to go through a very high level view of what we see as a good process for making games.
So we'll do this in a very concrete way in the project that we're working on right now. And at first, we started with a full week where we used Sharpies and sticky notes and index cards and pencil and paper just to come up with all of the ideas we could. Good ones, bad ones. We stuck them all to the wall and we saw what stuck. We saw what fell down. And through this, going back to what Dr. Frederick mentioned earlier about indie games having more opportunity to explore themes, we discovered this theme of community for our game. And once we had ideas, we immediately got into implementing some of those ideas. And we put them into the game engine, and we immediately started taking notes of what we like, what we dislike, things about the environment, about the level design, trying different mechanics, just to get things going as quickly as possible, to have something to respond to so that we could start iterating. And that's essentially where we're at now, is we are just iterating and playing the thing and trying again until we can hopefully eventually reach some of the visions that our incredible concept artists have been able to put forth of what we hope our game will look and feel like one day. And so to do all of this, we have a few tools we use, like Blender, Unity, Figma, ZBrush, Photoshop. And this isn't necessarily about our tools, it's about tools that you can use that are freely available to you, like Dr. Frederick mentioned earlier, so that you can do this thing as well. And so when it comes to that, there are a bunch of free game engines, including Unity, Unreal, Godot, and a bunch of other ones that are available. And they're just different tools. Use whichever one accomplishes what you need to do. There are different tools for artwork, including Blender for modeling, sculpting, animating. There's ZBrush Core Mini, which is now free as a specialized sculpting tool. And there's the poorly named GIMP, which is a free Photoshop alternative for digital painting and texturing models and things like that. And those are tools, but finally, there's also a bunch of free resources. Yeah, Unity Learn Premium just went free for everyone forever. There's also a bunch of good stuff on YouTube for all the game engines we mentioned. There's a bunch of free assets. If you are more on the design side or the engineering side and you want something to make your game look good, but you want to spend your time focusing on those other things, there's free assets, and there's a bunch of different resources for those. And then we have a local community as well in the Unity users group. And I'm sure you can find online communities for any of those game engines, or just for game design and game development in general. So hopefully some of those tools can help you get started in trying to do the same thing that we're doing.
Yeah, look at all these games. Look at all these games. They all look super different. I hope that through this talk, if there's one thing that you've taken away, is that video games are a much broader, wider, and deeper medium than you may have expected. And I want to phrase it this way, is think about it this way. Video games are a completely new medium. Completely new. On par with theater, film, novels. When you think of categories of medium, right? That doesn't come along very often. For a totally new medium to come along like that, that's super, super special. So I think it's worth just stopping and reflecting on just how exciting that is, to be alive in a time when a brand new medium is starting to come of age. And then if you're interested in it, that means you can get in there and start to shape what it should be. Pull it away from the toxic things that it may have started as, but see the things that it can be, and look and see at all the different possibilities of the art you can create, the stories you can tell, the experiences that you can share with the world. And I have to say, there's a whole lot of things that go into game development. We don't have the time to talk about them all in this intro talk, but I can, with pretty close certainty, say that if you have an interest, it probably directly applies to making games. It's not just about STEM fields. It's not just about programming. Those things are important, but those things alone don't make games and don't really make them shine in and of themselves. In fact, no one thing does, right? And so if you have an interest, don't think that you can't use it to make video games. And I guess as a parting thought, what I'll say is this isn't a faraway dream. This is something that you don't have to go to the coast or Austin to do. You shouldn't have to. That certainly it's easier, maybe. There's more opportunities there. But this is something that you can do right here, right now. How do we know? Well, we're examples sitting right in front of you talking to you. And we want to see more people like us getting involved in making stuff like this right here in Northwest Arkansas and at the state at large, because I don't think that this should be something that is solely sequestered to the northwest corner of the state. And so if you want to get started making games, there's going to be a lot of questions, a lot of bumps along the road, but I just say get started right now, make games, and you'll find, like just like a good story, that it's much more about the journey than the destination.
And so it'd be almost silly to not do a tiny bit of self-promotion. If you were interested in anything you heard here or saw, like we said, we're Causeway Studios. We have a website at causeway.games, and we exist on Twitter. And you could also follow up with either of us individually on Twitter. We're pretty easy to find. And that's our intro to game design.
I have to thank you guys so much. That truly was wonderful. Ran the whole outline from idea to complete product. So thank you all so much.
Absolutely. It's our pleasure.